All right, hello and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Bynum Sorrell, and I'm a researcher with the Digital Benefits Network at the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. And I will be your moderator for today's session. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's FormFest 2023 session titled Measuring a Form's Administrative Burden in Real Time. I'm so excited about all of the great sessions that we've had today. It's been awesome to hear so many personal stories about the impacts of Form already. I know I was thinking about this in my own life recently when I had to download an online application to fax a form to the IRS taxpayer advocates. So that was fun. But anyway, moving on. This is going to be a 1-hour session. Our speakers will be presenting first, and we'll save the last 20 minutes of our time together for questions and answers. So if you have a question either during the presentation or during the Q&A period, please use the chat function to share your questions, and then we'll moderate that Q&A session out loud so that our recording will capture both the questions that you all ask and the answers from our speakers. So let's go ahead and get started. I will be turning the session over to Quentin Stainhouse and Bryce Willie, who will get us started by sharing their formative form stories.
Actually, I didn't think about a formative form story, but I'll jump right into our slides. But Bryce, maybe you have something to share when we get to that part of the talk. I won't put you on the spot right now either, though. All right, so hi, I'm Quentin Stainhouse, and with Bryce Willie, we are part of the Suffolk Law School Legal Innovation and Technology Lab, and we'll talk a little bit about a tool that we developed at Suffolk Law School to help understand the complexity or burden that a form places on its user. And as you might guess, because we are based at a law school, the forms that we are talking about primarily are legal forms, which have a lot of similarities to other types of government forms, but also some differences, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll spend a bit of the front of our talk talking about what makes court forms good or bad. And I do say paper court forms or PDF court forms, but a lot of the lessons apply to digital forms like we've seen demoed here in the earlier session. Our score and how it works. We'll demo the tool so you can see a little bit how it works in real time, and some next steps for our project and how it fits into a broader ecosystem of tools that we've been developing. So our task really as form raters that we set ourselves was to become kind of like Anubis, measuring the good and bad of forms, taking them on into that afterlife, wherever all the good forms go. But we know that there are a lot of bad forms out there, and primarily we're interested in discovering the bad of forms. And this is the motivation for us. We're in the legal space, we're thinking about the access to justice problem. And I think at the center of that problem is that, as Damon John might say, this is a system that's built for us, by us, but in a bad way. We have a legal system that's designed primarily for lawyers. But the reality is that lawyers are not the most common actors in the legal system. This number comes from the National Center for State Courts. They found that only 1 in 4 people in civil legal cases was represented by an attorney. The Legal Services Corporation looks at the statistics a slightly different way, and they found that 92% of people who had legal problems that were presented did not end up getting a solution to those problems with an attorney in court. So we have this system where we think it's for lawyers, but really most of the players are self-represented. One of the ways we try to solve that problem is with forms, right? And there's actually a pretty good solution to representing legal problems. They lay out the information in a way that's really easy for a judge to understand. That's usually who these forms are designed for, judges to read. But they do help litigants know what information to present so that they have all the information, all the facts that the judge needs. And when we're talking about forms, I think one of the big differences from hearing some of the other presentations today that stuck out to me is that legal forms are really high stakes, right? We're not talking about getting a permit where maybe if you don't get that permit, you can try again later. These are things like requesting a domestic violence restraining order. where obviously your safety, your physical safety is at stake if you do or don't get that order granted. They might be things like getting a guardianship. Guardianship is sometimes called the civil death penalty in the legal system, because if someone is granted guardianship over you, your right to make decisions about your own personal choices is gone, at least for some temporary time. Things like child custody, all kinds of really important decisions about your personal safety and liberty are at stake in legal forms. And one of the ways that we saw talked about today, and a solution that we've focused on quite a bit in our lab, is building these expert systems or guided tools that walk you through that process step by step of completing the form and getting your information out there. So you understand what's happening. It's not just for the judge to understand if you've gotten the right information on the form. But it's not always easy to scale that solution. And I want to give you a couple of examples of the way that choices on forms can make a really big difference. And we'll talk a little bit about how our tool works and the details of our score. So here's an example from a system that I developed as an expert system as a legal aid attorney. This tool was designed to help people who are facing eviction complete an eviction answer in court. It's a really important step to take to protect your rights. But one of the questions that came up on that form was, do you want to have a jury trial? As you can imagine, a lot of tenants, when they were faced with that question, hadn't already thought of an answer to that. They didn't realize that they probably could get a jury to stop their eviction process. And we found through analytics that that was one of the questions that really stumped those tenants, and we had a lot of drop-off. So we had to think about ways. What seemed like a really simple question, it's really like a checkbox, yes or no, involved a really complex thought process that the tenant had to resolve before they could move on and continue to use the form. This is a similar kind of problem. This is a very large open-ended question. It's not a checkbox. It's the affidavit that you file in Massachusetts if you want to request a restraining order to get protection from abuse. And I've zoomed in here on the only guidance that you get on how to respond to this question. It's really just these 2 sentences here, which says, tell us about the abuse. And we get a little clue here to say things about what happened and when, and a little bit more guidance about including information about injuries, medical treatment, and history. And you'll notice that the last part of this tiny paragraph just tells us that unless we file a special motion, the affidavit's going to be public. Faced with this question, the person who's trying to request this petition has a really complicated task in front of them. So they have this guidance that almost all the page should be devoted to the story. They have a little bit of a clue about what kinds of facts to mention, but they have to sit down and process and think and recall what all those details are. They have to think about what information to keep in, what information to leave out. They have to structure it into a narrative that convinces a judge. And I should highlight, with a lot of these forms, there may be an opportunity for a hearing, but there may not be. It's sometimes the judge is making a decision on the pleading. Especially for something like this restraining order petition, they may grant it just from reading the affidavit as a temporary grant, and then there might be a hearing later to review whether it should be extended. But getting it right at this stage is very time sensitive and may be critical to the person getting the protection that they need. Let's compare this very open-ended question to a similar form in Washington State. In Washington State, they've taken that open-ended affidavit approach and they've broken it across 4 separate pages. It's 7 questions in all. There's still plenty of space for the user to tell their story, but we're able to zoom in a little bit more on the specific information that they need to provide. So we get prompted specifically to talk about medical treatment in one section of the affidavit portion here. Talk about things like substance use and abuse, very important to know, not mentioned on the Massachusetts tiny paragraph of instructions. Talk about children and the effect of the abuse on children. and what's happening with children in the home. And that's the last one that I've highlighted of the 7 questions. Those are some of the kind of key things. But you also might notice here that at the top of the instructions, the first page of instructions, we have a much more broken down and neatly formatted list of information that kind of gives the user some guidance as to what to do. 2 very different approaches. One actually involves more questions and more space the user has to answer, but it's much simpler for the user to provide the information that they need to get to make their case. So I haven't mentioned yet how many forms there are. I think you probably have a sense, if many of you are in the government space, there are a lot of forms for lots of different problems. That's true in the legal system too. We actually did a survey. We gathered forms from 47 US states and the District of Columbia, and we got to 24,000 forms total. We used those forms for our research. And to give you a sense of like kind of the standard deviation, I think a typical state that really has sat down and focused on building standardized forms has between 500 and 1,000 forms for different legal problems, many of which have to be filed in combination. One of the outliers is California with 1,500 forms for different legal problems. So I'm going to turn it over from here to Bryce, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about what we decided we can use to find good and bad forms.
Thanks, Quinn. Yes, so given that we know this is a tough problem to scale, tackling legal forms and making them better, so we need a more targeted plan of action. A good start would be if we had a way to find good forms that we could use as models in other states to improve their forms, and also a way to find poor forms that could be prioritized. So at Suffolk, we went back to the basics. We read a whole lot of literature about forms from people who have worked with the problem, some of whom are here today. We found a lot of great advice about how to make good forms, but we didn't find any specific formulas that could be applied at scale to all these forms. So we decided to make our own automated score that we could use to find these model forms and these poor forms, and this score that could also recommend ways to make improvements. Which one of the first things we did run into and sort of went into the literature on a lot was readability formulas. And notably, courts use a lot of readability formulas at the moment. They'll take the text of a form and they'll measure its reading grade level with something like Flesch-Kincaid, Smog, Dale-Chall. There are dozens of such readability scores, and they'll target a specific level, like a 6th grade reading level for that, for the text of the form. However, reading formulas just don't work well on forms for a few reasons. The first being that readability formulas are made for narrative text. They look at things like sentence length and the number of syllables per sentence. They're calibrated on longer paragraphs, not necessarily short sentences, and they're validated. They're also validated on sort of like longer stories. Court forms, however, have very short prompts, as Quentin showed earlier in the protection order. And they also don't necessarily have standard punctuation, especially when it comes to things like multiple choices or radio buttons, or sort of radio checkboxes or radio choices, etc. Additionally, reading the form isn't the only thing you do with the form. You actually have to fill it in. So readability of a form is only part of the problem that we're dealing with here, and it's only part of what makes a form so complex to fill in. And then finally, readability scores don't necessarily tell you how to improve the text. Since their readability scores are looking at simply sentence, usually they're looking at sentence length and sort of number of syllables in a sentence. They're more of causation than they're more of correlation than causation. And so simply using shorter sentences doesn't actually improve readability at all. You have to go to deeper level and sort of restructure how you're trying to communicate what you are in order to actually improve readability. So in short, readability formulas just aren't really built what they're using them for. They have a place, but they leave a bit to be desired when it comes to forms. So to expand past readability, we need to look at what makes a form a form. Specifically, can a person actually fill in fields on a form? Can they comprehend the prompts, i.e. can they read and understand what the form is used for, or what it's asking for? Can they accurately provide the information they need to, meaning can their life situation be portrayed on the form as it is without having to compromise or take shortcuts? And then finally, can they provide a complete response to the form, meaning that there aren't parts of their life situation that are important and relevant that simply aren't asked about on the form, or there isn't a place on the form for them to communicate that. The other part of what makes a core form good or bad is whether is given that someone can actually fill in the form, how much effort does it take to do that? Does it take an exorbitant amount of time? Are there any sort of traumatic triggers that the form's questions might raise? So those are the things that we consider when we're looking at that. And one of the first frameworks that we used to sort of dive a bit more into the burdens of what a form, or sort of the burdens of the form, is this framework of administrative burden sort of introduced in a lot of literature by Pamela Hurd, Don Moynihan. And that splits into a few different sections. The first is learning burden, sort of actually learning that you have a legal problem and how you can address it. And then participatory burden, which is actually filling in the form. This is the most important thing, and generally what we're focusing on. What we'll try and focus on for the rest of this presentation. And then finally, psychological burdens, which is anything sort of from mental health or the stressors of simply having to go through this process. And in addition to things like the stigma and isolation of actually having to engage in a court process, you might be getting divorced, things like that. And again, we'll focus mostly on participation burdens, but all three of these burdens are sort of interconnected in a way that we can't isolate them as much. And so we do need to keep all of them in mind. Some burdens are unavoidable. So a burden might sort of sound like it's a bad thing, and in most cases, if we can avoid a burden, we can. But some are unavoidable. And say in a petition for a protection order, you might need to answer some questions about the nature of your abuse, which can be sort of re-traumatizing. However, we do need to know that information in order to have the best outcome for that person's problem. And sort of as opposed to something that the form itself might introduce as a burden that isn't inherently in the process, i.e. asking for a lot of information separately multiple times. What we call complexity is sort of what we're treating as the combination of both this inherent burden and this incidental burden. And so if we're paying attention to the burden on filling in a form, we felt like we really needed to pay attention to what someone is being asked to provide on the form. Again, the key difference between a simple narrative text and the form is that you have to create and then write in the answer. And those answers can vary a lot. So another framework we used was by Caroline Jarrett and Jerry Gaffney, which sort of describes different types of answers that you might need when filling in a form. Slot-in, gathered, third-party, and created. The first of those is a slot-in answer, and these are sort of answers, things that you'll know off the top of your head. You know your name, you know how to spell your own name, you know how to write your signature, you'll know your address, etc. The next type of answer is a gathered answer, and these are things that you'll also have access to, but you'll have to go and find it. And the best example of this is sort of your driver's license number. You'll certainly have access to if you have your driver's license, but you'll have to go, and the hardest part of that is finding your wallet and looking at your driver's license for that number. And then the next type of answer is a third-party answer, which is similar to a gathered answer, but a little bit different in that it's something that someone else would have to gather for you. So if you're divorced and you need to know your ex-husband's address, or say your ex-husband's current income, then you'd have to go and ask him for that information, which sort of that becomes the longest part and most difficult part of actually getting that information. It's not the information itself, it's having to go to someone else to get it and communicate back and forth, wait for them to actually get it to you, etc. Finally, there are creative fields, and this is sort of what Quentin was elaborating on earlier, of when filling in the protection form and also trying to determine if you need a jury trial. These are the things, sort of the meat of the form, and things that are most critical to actually getting your legal arguments to the judge. And it's also where most of the burden of legal forms are. So it's also worth noting that most legal forms almost always have created fields. There's rarely going to be a motion that you're filing in a court that isn't going to ask you to elaborate on some legal argument that's going to appear before the judge or eventually be surfaced in a hearing or something like that. So knowing, sort of keeping all of this in mind, we know what types of answers people might give or have to give on forms, and what types of burdens that those might evoke on the form. We start to have a good grasp of what indicators of complexity to look at and what we actually use in our score. The first of which, sort of to make sure someone can understand and read the form, we do consider the reading grade level, since it is one aspect and an important aspect. However, we don't simply use a single reading level formula. We use lots of them, as many as we can, and sort of take a consensus. So if most of them are saying that the reading grade level of a form is 9th grade, and a few are saying that it's 12th grade, we take the consensus, so we say it's a 9th grade reading level form. We also look at the vocabulary of the form, and specifically, we look at the percent of difficult words or sort of not commonly used words in the form, something that might sort of stump people when they're initially reading over the form. We use natural language processing to look at the sentence structure of the form, so we can tell, specifically we look at sort of active voice versus passive voice, active voice being much more simpler for someone when you're initially reading through compared to passive voice. We also look at the number of legal citations on forms, which indicate sort of extra complexity that someone might have to keep in mind. The number of fields per page on a form, which is a good indicator of sort of the white space that someone might be given when they're filling in a form and how dense a form is. If you have one page that's asking someone to fill in 50 different questions, that's a very, very dense form. And then finally, sort of the use of all caps, which also sort of can inhibit readability a bit. And to make sure that someone can actually provide a complete response, our score looks at each field of the form, and we sort of we classify each field such as one of these categories that we went over: slot in, gathered, etc. And we then use that classification to estimate the amount of effort that each question will take, and how long it takes to fill that in. We also note when fields might be asking someone to add two previous answers together, or sort of anytime they otherwise do any sort of math, which puts extra burden on the person filling in the form. And finally, we consider the time burden of the form. Many of the previous metrics also sort of we take into account here, but some additional metrics we have are sort of looking at the number of pages of the form and how long it is, and then also the expected answer length of each of the fields, sort of how much space is given on the form to fill in an answer. Obviously, again, going back to the protection order, the Massachusetts form does expect you to write a fair amount given given that main text area is more than half of the page. However, some questions we can also keep in mind. Some court forms might not always give you enough space for people to answer them fully, and so we keep that in mind as well as when we're doing things. And so our complexity score is a combination of all of these above of all of these above matrix, and we weight metrics, and we weight certain ones compared to others. Note that we don't necessarily, or we aren't currently measuring emotional burden. When we started this project a few years ago, we weren't super certain about being able to do that in an automated way that would be sort of a responsible use of the technology and making sure that we would be accurate. Obviously, the technology has progressed a bit since then, and it's one of the things that we are keeping in mind as we look to improve our complexity score. And so to get an idea of what all of these metrics look like on real forms, as Quentin mentioned, we have we did a survey of many different legal forms from different states, and we have a sort of an initial a subset of the 24,000 forms. So we sort of ran all of these metrics on 15,000 of those forms, and the data is here, as you can see. And I think the main thing I want you to take away from this is just how complex a lot of legal forms are. The average number of pages being almost 3 pages, and how much each of these can vary, either from 1 page or all the way up to 10 pages or even more. And the number of fields per page is also astronomical, honestly, 50 field, averaging 50 fields per page. And additionally, sort of the amount of difficult words that are present in forms, and the amount of passive voice that's in form instructions and in prompts. It sort of just makes it all for a very complex start for most people trying to fill out their forms. So at this point, I'll hand it back to Quentin, who will sort of show you a bit more how these metrics work out on a particular form.
Great. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Rate My PDF tool now itself. And let me see, I think if I switch tabs, it should update the screen share. Give it a try. Do you see? Nope, I'll have to do a new share. Hold on. And I think I'll just share the whole window here. Let's try that. Okay, so this is what the Rate My PDF website looks like. It is a public website. You can visit now if you want to try it out. Maybe the audience here is going to crash it, so just keep that in mind. But I preloaded some screens so we can switch around and see what that looks like. It's ratemypdf.com if you're curious. So what I'm going to do here, just for simplicity, is I have a few PDFs loaded that you can take a look at. This is the military affidavit. This is probably one of the most common forms across the country that gets filled in. Anytime that one of the parties does not show up to court, you have to fill in this affidavit to say what you know about whether that person is in the military or not. It's a pretty simple and straightforward form. Let's see how it does with our tool. So it's been given a complexity index here. This number is not weighted. It's just we've added up all the different metrics, and then we've looked at the average, and we say if it's within the average, it gets this yellow. If it's within a standard deviation below the average, it's green. Standard deviation above is red in this little dial here. We do give it an estimated form completion time. We're not so confident in that yet. But most importantly, we dive into some really specific suggestions. And those include things like accessibility. We look at whether the PDF is tagged, which is kind of just the minimum. We currently are using GPT-3 to just give some very basic summary and information. We ask it to write that summary at a 6th grade reading level. And it does decently at that task. And we're using some substitution tables for things like vocabulary that might be difficult. There's some common phrases. Plainlanguage.gov in the United States has this really nice table that we've turned into a substitution table that we could use pretty much directly in context, showing sentence by sentence what phrases or words in the original text might be better replaced with a simpler term. So it can help you really act directly on that information and advice. We see here, we're also highlighting things like citations. We show the full list of what are considered difficult words outside the Dale Chall word list for right now. Although one of our projects in our lab is to come up with a better word list that represents more modern words people are familiar with that are going to appear on court forms. Words like divorce, they're not so unfamiliar, but are not on the Dale Chall word list. And then we also go through some of the other suggestions here. And really importantly, we've highlighted here that we're not capturing everything here, right? There are things we can't measure with this automated tool, and we highlight those every time you upload a form to the site. Just to contrast this a little bit, I'll just have these preloaded results for a few more forms. So this is what's called the civil docketing statement in Massachusetts. Anytime you file an appeal, this is required. Much more complex form than the military affidavit. And you see it gets a much more, a higher score on our complexity index. And completion time is astronomically larger here as well. And we can dive in a little bit and see what that complexity score is made out of. And I think you'll see it's, there's a lot of this large, and this words per page seems to have a large impact on this form's score. This is around the pretty average number of fields per page. 20 just happens to have a lot of pages. Here is another feature which I wanted to demonstrate to you because I think this is important too. This is not directly weighted into the complexity of the form, but this is a child custody form in, let's see, where's this, Alabama. And it's quite long. It's quite dense, actually. We have more than 40 fields per page on this form, which is twice the typical form. And also we're able to measure things like use of gendered language, in addition to the things I was showing you before. So we highlight all the terms that are gendered and make suggestions to use more gender neutral language. And you can see here that stuck out as one of the big issues here. The number of fields, 90 fields and 44 fields per page. Those are really big factors in the complexity of this particular form. Accessibility, again, that's not directly tied into our score, but we find it really important to highlight for people who are working with forms. And I'm going to switch back to our slides here now. And I think we have just a few more here. Okay, so some backup slides there. All right, so actually you might be interested, and I think I saw this question on the chat already, to know like, well, how do you know our score is any good? And I'll just walk you through what we've done to try to validate that to ourselves. We actually did ask expert reviewers from a diverse group of states to rate a subset of our forms. So they rated 40 forms from a diverse group of states. We had them look at, I think, forms from, I think maybe 6 states, and we had at least 2 reviewers for each form. Oh, actually, it says here 3. We got 176 individual ratings. And so we asked these kind of questions. So how complex do you think this form is? Which form do you think is better? And then we actually asked some more detailed questions to help us improve the weighting that we've used for those different features that Bryce described. And we got really good results without any tweaking or weighting. We found experts agreed with each other. So that meant that it wasn't just like a random number generator. When an expert says that a form is good or bad, other experts tend to agree with that first expert. And if we just added our score into the mix as a expert itself, it agreed with the other experts quite strongly. It had a good correlation, which means that we felt very confident that you can use our Rate My PDF tool to get a good first pass at whether that form is good or bad, and of course apply the suggestions as they are appropriate and relevant to your form. Rate My PDF is a website that you can use for one form at a time, but we actually use our forms, this tool in bulk to look at a whole state's forms and then give some signal as to, okay, which forms should be prioritized. That's one of the really important things that we think you can use with this kind of tooling is you can understand whether are all your forms problematic? Are they in one subject area? Is there a review that has to be done? And then maybe rank and rate those to decide which ones you should work on improving first. This does focus on forms that are kind of, have these open spaces that look kind of like court forms. You can upload either a PDF or a Word file to this tool. And if it doesn't have any form fields, you'll still get the information that we've provided. It does not need to be a court form. That's just what we've been focusing on with our research. So if you wanted to learn more about our tool, I know we're going to be shifting to questions pretty soon. I'll highlight a few things. We do have a paper about it that was presented at the International Conference on AI and Law, so you can read a little bit more detail. We have put together this website, which has guidance on writing good questions that we gathered from many resources. And so this is kind of turned into our style guide when we're doing automation of forms. So this is another free resource that's linked from the Rate My PDF website that will walk you through how to do a good job with question automation. For us, what comes next? This is just, as I mentioned, one piece of what our lab is working on. We see it as having a place in a robust ecosystem of improving forms and user experience around forms. So some of the other tools that are part of that ecosystem, I'm just going to highlight here. We have the Form Explorer page where you can explore and interact with that data set of the 24,000 forms. Maybe not all of them are up here on this website, but it's a really large proportion of them. You can go state by state and see what forms they have and explore some of the detailed statistics about those forms. The assembly line website is where we've built kind of a framework and pattern for doing automation of these forms. The framework is built for DocAssemble, which is a particular form automation technology. And we have a lot of reusable components that help you do automation of court forms at scale. One of the tools that is part of that ecosystem is the Weaver tool, which is a tool like the ones that was demonstrated in the previous session. It's a form building tool. But what its outputs is, instead of a completed form, it is a draft or prototype of a DocAssemble interview, which is a very flexible platform for building using Python to customize and have a very customized and tailored user experience, which we feel fits well with the complexity that interactive forms demand of litigants when they're trying to deal with problems in court. And then we've built and are starting to continue to build out this question library. And I've highlighted here the pronoun question. We have some guidance on how to ask for pronouns in a thoughtful way. Name, address, gender, language. And we have a number of other examples of questions that we're adding to this library slowly over time from our automation of these forms. And those are, again, freely available. All of our code is open source. Actually, Bryce, I don't know if you want to put a link to any of the GitHub repositories so you can see that as well. So there's a lot more I think we could learn from this repository of forms, and we're tackling that this year in our lab with the help of students. And one of those questions of interest to us, as I mentioned, is what actually is a really good vocabulary that we should be looking at when we say a word is hard or easy. We think the Dale Chall word list is a good start, but we think by looking at the words that are actually used on court forms and doing some testing, we can get a better list of words. And I think there's more we can learn also from the expert feedback that we got about improving our score and improving the weights and making them even better. Okay, I'm going to pause there for questions. I guess we're 2 minutes ahead of schedule.
Thank you guys so much for that presentation. That was really excellent. I learned a lot. I'm super excited to play with this tool. And we've also gotten a lot of excellent questions in the chat. So I'm going to start with, this is kind of two questions that came in. Someone had asked, does this work only for court forms? And I think you all already addressed that technically it could be used for other things. But as a follow-up to that, another question that we received was, do you know who's using your tool? So have you heard of any other use cases for people using this tool? That would be kind of one question. And then do you have data on who is using it more broadly?
I think Quentin hop off. I can answer this though. So yes. So as Quentin sort of alluded to, we have you can use this on non-court forms. We sort of have calibrated our scores specifically with court forms in mind, and sort of the number of questions that you might have been asked, and sort of a lot of our statistics are sort of based and normalized on court forms. But absolutely, we're one of the reasons we're here is sort of to bring this to a wider audience, and we definitely sort of realize that government projects specifically could very much benefit from this sort of project. I think I'm not sure if we mentioned earlier, but certainly I think I've seen in the chat as well. The Paperwork Reduction Act was sort of one of the things that we looked at a lot when looking at how to consider the complexity of a form.
And I'll add, as far as like who's using our tool right now, our research was funded by Pew Charitable Trusts, their civil court modernization project. So they've been kind of helping us find users, and they're in touch with lots of users. And then the National Center for State Courts. So that's our user base right now. It's being used by some individual court departments, like one by one, to try to improve forms. And we've been working with Michigan and using our tool there. They have this whole form improvement project that the legislature funded for improving their court forms.
Awesome. And as I think actually a really nice follow-up to that, mentioning like a specific state's project, what kinds of incentives do courts have to measure their forms along these lines and improve them?
I mean, the truth is that the courts are not super, just like other parts of government, right? Maybe even more so. The courts are pretty independent, and they have a lot of ability to decide if they consider litigants to be end users that they have to serve, or if they want to focus on just the internal stakeholders of the court. So, but I think there are a lot of people in courts who are interested in improving user experience, and it's probably a bit embarrassing to see that their forms are really hard to use when they can make them better. We've seen a number of states launch like wholesale, let's improve all of our forms. California was one of the first to have a plain language revision of all of their forms. Like I think it was 15 or 20 years ago. Washington State followed. As I said, we're working with Michigan, and then Maryland is another project. So those are just states that I'm aware of. I think there's interest in it. It's just it's hard to know how to do it. So this is one of the tools we hope can make it easier.
Next question. Someone in the chat was also wondering, did you test any of these forms directly with users or shadow those who were filling out any of these forms, assuming that sensitivity or privacy allowed for that?
That was something we hoped to do, but we didn't have a chance to. So that's where we think the expert rating is our proxy for that. And we tried to gather a number of expert opinions to do that, to compare our benchmark our score against those expert opinions.
A question that came up a couple times in the chat was around what happens to PDFs that are uploaded to the site. So could you share more about whether any of those are stored or cached on the site after they're uploaded?
That's a good question. Right now, we built this as like a prototype. We'll put more information about that. It actually is stored, but anytime we restart the server, it's erased. We're not collecting those and using those, and we'll clarify that with the terms of use soon.
Yeah, the only reason we're storing them is so if you upload a form, you don't have to wait the 30 seconds to like maybe 30 to 45 seconds that it takes to analyze the form. You don't have to wait that again if you upload the same form. We'll just be like, oh, you uploaded this one again. Here's your stuff immediately. So.
Great. And I think that actually starts to answer a question that we just got in the chat about how long it takes the tool to analyze a form. So I heard you say about 30 seconds, Bryce.
Yeah, it varies for how long the form is. I think, I think specifically like we sort of mentioned, we're looking at each field on the form. We're trying to classify it, and so longer forms with more fields and more pages obviously takes a bit longer. But I think in our experience, it's for one pagers, probably like 10 to 15 seconds. For a big packet, that's maybe 5 or 10 pages with a whole lot of fields, it might take up to a minute. But yeah.
Yeah, I did try uploading the whole proceedings from iCale, and it took like maybe 5 or 10 minutes to do it.
Cool. And yeah, seeing in the chat that I think there's some forms that are maybe taking a little bit longer, but Quentin, as you mentioned, I think we're pushing a lot of traffic right now to the site during this session, which is exciting.
Yeah, you very well may crash it, so forgive us if that's the case. Try it again in a week or a day or two.
We've been talking a lot about some of the maybe higher level questions about the tool, but getting into some of the measures themselves, we got a question around the measure for gathered questions. So how do you differentiate what we might think about as easy versus difficult gathered questions? So for example, something like driver's license number, which may be relatively easy if someone has access to that identification, compared to something like specific employment dates that might need to be cross-referenced against a W-2 or other tax records, or might just be less easy to recall.
We don't. That's the quick answer, right? I don't know if you want to add anything else, Bryce, but essentially we're trying to give you a rough direction, and we don't pretend this is like a scientifically precise measurement of your form, but it will tell you like, hey, this is something you should look closer at and probably improve. But once you've improved or changed it, I think it's not going to do as good of a job at measuring the form once you've changed it, right? Like let's say you deleted 20 fields from that not so great Alabama form that I showed. That's going to improve the score, but it still might be a really bad form. So we want you to look at the suggestions and improve them holistically rather than trying to focus on one measure. And it's going to be off in some direction for any given metric, but we feel the aggregate of the measures is what's going to give you the most, we're most confident about.
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons we specifically have sort of tried to break out like specific suggestions, places for improvement, as opposed to just giving someone a score and sort of how we calculate that, since that's a the places we are suggesting improvements are places we are for sure that like confident that changing this would improve the form. And the other parts, you have to have more information about. You have to sort of know the context that the form lives in and whatnot to be to actually to know how to improve it. So.
Great, thanks. Returning again to the site itself, one of the other questions we got in the chat was, what kind of usability testing did you do on the site itself?
None, but maybe it was something we can do. We are setting up a usability testing lab in our program, and maybe that's a tool we can work on improving. We did get feedback from expert users of the tool, our funders at Pew, some of the state court partners, and we've been incorporating that, but we didn't do any true usability testing on the site itself.
Another question from the chat, and I think that you all started to touch on this in your presentation around that the measure or tool right now isn't looking at emotional burden and sort of why that is in terms of technical reasons. But someone in the chat was wondering, how do you plan to incorporate, or are you planning to incorporate measuring emotional burden in the future? And are you thinking about any capacity building for understanding emotional burden for form creators, like some of the other resources and guidance that you've created?
So one of the other tools I should have put on that slide that isn't there, we've built a tool that lets you, it's a traditional machine learning classifier for legal problems, and it like that are given in free text, and it helps you understand, well, where does that fit in a taxonomy of legal problems? That's something I think we could add today. It's just not on the site yet. I think it's going to be like that marker of accessibility and gendered language, where we're going to highlight it and let the user see what our expectations are of the emotional burden, or what kind of form it is, and is this something that just happens to fall in an emotionally burdened space, and show that on the page. But it probably won't be directly calculated into our score. Maybe if we were really confident about it, it would be appropriate, I guess, because it's still one of those burdens like time. But the truth is, court forms, as I said, are inherently high stakes. So I think if we're going to try to compare forms against one another, and we're saying, okay, this is a bad form because it's letting you get protection from abuse versus asking for a name change, I don't think that's quite as useful information to use when you're comparing across forms.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And another question that we received from the chat, and given kind of who our audience is today, I imagine this might be relevant to others who are viewing, not just this question asker in particular, but how do you all take care of yourselves while doing this work? You're trying to fix some really frustrating things, and that might be pretty stressful to be working on.
Do you want to go, Bryce? I'm interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, no, it is a hard question. I feel like I have we definitely have like some of the stories that we get back from people we've helped certainly are sort of like anchors, and it's like, yeah, this is what we're doing this for. There was one particular story of someone who was able to use our guided forms, like Quentin said. Another part of this, a large part of this project that we also work on is sort of automating, or not automating, turning these paper forms into digital forms that people can fill in. And we got a story from the appeals court in Massachusetts where someone was able to use that form to stop an eviction actively in process early, sort of in the pandemic when that was happening. And so I sort of, at least for me, I sort of keep those few stories in mind, and sort of know like that's focus on like that's sort of how what we're aiming for. So.
Yeah, and I spent 12 years as a legal aid attorney before joining the lab, so I got used to much more immediate in your face kind of stories. But I focus on the fact that this is a way to help people at scale. Like I talked about this before in other contexts, that 12 years as a legal aid attorney, I helped touch a little over 1,000 cases. And one of the automated tools that I worked on helps 2,000 people at least get more time in their eviction just every year. So this is a way to scale the help, and that's motivating.
Yeah, thank you both for your answers to that question. Another question from the chat, and I think this is maybe a bigger picture question about the ecosystem, but how do you balance sort of the use of automated tools like this with research and testing with real people? So maybe thinking about this question a little bit further, is it potential to think about like what are the benefits of those different approaches? Where are they useful? Where are they complementary?
If you have the budget to improve an individual one-off form with usability testing, you're going to get much better results than you do from our tool. So that there's no question that observing someone using the form is always best. I think where tools like this fit in the most is when you want to scale that approach to 1,500 forms like California has, and know which form should you start working on, which one is the worst, and maybe catch some patterns. Yeah. And I think it's important to say that not every, even though you can do usability testing on the cheap, and it can be very effective, that still may be something that not every court system is in a position to do when they're embarking on an individual form improvement process. And you can use this tool repeatedly to kind of benchmark your forms and get a sense of if you're going in the right direction without doing a new usability test each time. So maybe this is a way to save some of the human effort early on, and maybe you just do the human testing at the end. That's another way to think about using it.
Yeah, something really interesting something that really resonated with me in your response is that point about prioritization, sort of where do we start focusing first? And then, yeah, one question, I think that this is well addressed, but just want to make sure we're all clear about it. A question from the chat earlier was, is this tool free to use? It seems like it from the site, but are there premium tools or other features that require payment?
Nope, not only is it free, but you could run your own copy of it if you wanted. It's all open source.
Awesome. Another question from the chat, we've gotten a lot, which is super exciting. Are there any health and human services agencies that you all are aware of that are using this tool? And if so, are you able to say who?
No, not yet. So we've started out in just the court space, but I think I saw Jim Moffat's on the chat. So we've been talking with 10X about using some of the tools that are in our ecosystem. And hopefully we'll be able to help more people in the Article 3 group of folks there.
Just taking a look at the time, we have a few more minutes for questions. So if you have anything else that you would like to submit, the chat is open. And returning to one of the questions that we received earlier, and this was very early in y'all's presentation, but how can we collect information we need without re-traumatizing an individual or minimizing the risk of re-traumatization? And I think that you all mentioned trauma-informed design when you were talking kind of at the beginning of the presentation. Maybe give you an opportunity to share if there's anything else you want to say on that topic.
You want to take it, Bryce? No.
I will say I don't think I am aware of trauma-informed design, and it's something I try and like keep in mind a lot. I'm not necessarily like trained in trauma-informed design or anything like that, and so I would say I'm not sure, honestly. No, Quentin, you feel better.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about the example of the protection order form, you know, the more you can separate it into facts and reduce the burden the person has to like collect and organize and synthesize those, I think that's a helpful thing. And being thoughtful about reuse of information and avoiding people having to tell their story multiple times. And we do see that people are asked many times to say the same story. And that's unnecessary. Not something we're directly measuring, but it's something you should certainly keep in mind when dealing with traumatic subjects. Yeah.
Thanks. And it looks like we've got a few more questions in the chat. Early on in your presentation, you mentioned that GPT-3 is involved in the process. Would you be able to share more about that?
Yeah, so right now we have just a few places we're using GPT-3. It's part of our plain language suggestions for the form. We do use machine learning, traditional machine learning approaches, and we found that when we tried switching to GPT-3 or 3.5, and even more so with GPT-4, it could do a much better job than our hand-trained classifier, just because we didn't have enough examples that were classified. So we are probably going to be using it to help improve our classifier that says which bucket of answer type is this going to have. We talk, you know, like third party, gathered, created, or slot in. We're going to probably use it for that. We're going to probably use it to help us rewrite the field names, which helps us standardize and compare across forms. And we're probably going to use it in a few of those places where it's like we throw information, add a classifier, we ask it to do something with it. We're using traditional ML approaches there, and we want to switch to GPT-3 or some other offline version because we think it can do a lot better with a large language model than the traditional ML approach.
And then another question, we talked about how this works for PDFs, but someone was wondering, does this tool work with digital forms? So like a URL to a form, I assume?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think right now, I don't think we literally let you upload a URL and say download the form there, but we could. That's an easy change. I wonder if maybe the author meant, does it work with guided interviews, what we call them?
Sure.
And the answer is actually where we started. We started looking at building a tool to help you improve doc assemble interviews, which are a YAML format. They're nice, you can parse them. Mm-hmm. And we did get part way down that project. And I think, and then we realized there's maybe a couple dozen of those per state when it comes to court processes, and there's 1,000 paper forms. So that's where we wanted to start. And I think we're going to be integrating, going back the other direction and starting to copy over some of the features of Rate My PDF to our tool that analyzes doc assemble interviews. I don't know that we'll get to like the whole world of forms that are automated because it's much harder to parse and click through a website and get all of the fields, but we can do it with the doc assemble interview for sure.
Great. All right. Well, thank you both so much for sharing and for your thoughtful responses to all of the great questions that we got in the chat. Since it is almost 3:30 Eastern, we'll go ahead and start to close out. But would just really like to extend a huge round of applause and thank you to both of you, Quentin and Bryce, for sharing about this work and sharing your expertise.